Hey you. Yes, you. Where are you watching from? And what time is it right now? Drop it in the comments. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Now, let's get into tonight's true crime case. So, don't forget subscribe this channel and turn on notification. Story 1. I boarded the night train to Budapest under a pale sliver of moonlight. The spring wind still carried the bite of winter as it whipped around Keleti station. My suitcase wheels whispered over the cracked tiles, echoing in the near silence. The platform was quiet for a Thursday night, quieter than it should have been, perhaps. I chalked it up to the weather. March had been colder than expected. My carriage, number 7, was near the end of the train. I climbed aboard, shoulders tight from travel fatigue. The interior was dim, lit by low amber bulbs that made every shadow stretch longer than it should. The corridor was empty as I walked to my compartment. The door clicked shut behind me with a softness that didn't match the metal sound I expected. My seat faced backward. I always preferred watching where I came from rather than where I was going. Something about seeing the past slide away behind me felt grounding. The window was speckled with condensation, and as I wiped it, I caught a glimpse of someone on the platform staring directly at my window. They didn't move, just stood there. No luggage, no companion. I turned away, probably just another traveler lost in thought. Still, something unsettled me. I waited for the jolt of departure, and when it came, I relaxed. The rhythm of the train calmed my nerves. I watched the darkness roll by, towns and trees flickering in and out of existence. An hour passed. I hadn't seen a conductor or another passenger since boarding. Even the quiet, usually broken by announcements or the distant murmur of other travelers, was absent. The silence felt thick, like will press to my ears. I stepped into the corridor, intending to stretch my legs, maybe find Stewart. As I walked, I noticed the compartments were all closed and dark. No motion behind the glass. Not a single open door. Just rows and rows of stillness. I paused near the middle of the carriage, where the vestibule led into the next. I thought I heard something from the neighboring car, a soft sound like fabric rustling or someone shifting in their seat. I reached for the door. It didn't open. No lights were on inside that carriage. The glass between the cars was dark, reflecting only my own faint image. Returning to my compartment, I realized my suitcase had moved. Only slightly. I had left it upright near the far wall, but now it leaned against my seat. I hadn't hit a bump. The train's movement was smooth. I placed it back and sat down, telling myself it was nothing. Just tired eyes playing tricks. The hours stretched longer. The night refused to thin. Outside, villages flickered and vanished again into the night. Occasionally, I thought I saw someone on the side of the tracks, people standing motionless in the dark, far from any station. They vanished too quickly to be certain. Maybe they were just trees. At 2:13 a.m., the lights flickered. Just once. A single pulse, as if the train inhaled sharply. When they returned, my door was open. I was certain I had closed it. I rose, stepped out into the corridor. It was still empty, but now the far end of the car, the direction we had come from, had a faint light glowing beneath one of the doors. The only one aside from mine. I approached it slowly, unsure what I would find. The door was closed, but the light leaking from beneath was steady. As I neared, I noticed something else, the nameplate beside the compartment. It had no number, just a single red mark, like a thumbprint, smeared but deliberate. I didn't touch the door. Instead, I returned to my seat, drawing the curtain over the window. The sense of being watched had grown unbearable. Even the hum of the train now seemed ominous, like a lullaby out of tune. I couldn't sleep, so I sat, watching the motionless curtain and trying not to think about the unmarked compartment behind me. Just past 3 a.m., the train slowed. No announcement, no lights outside. We were in the middle of a forest or perhaps a field. I couldn't tell. The trees were tall and hunched, their tops vanishing into the fog. The train stopped completely, humming softly under my feet. I waited for an explanation that didn't come. A noise, faint but undeniable, came from the corridor again. Not steps, not voices, just something dragging, like fabric being pulled over metal. I opened the compartment door. The corridor was dimmer than before. The red emergency lights flickered at intervals now. Far down the corridor, where the other compartments had been sealed tight hours before, one door hung open. I stepped out. The air smelled different, damp cold, with a metallic tang I couldn't place. I inched forward. The open door revealed nothing but shadow. I peered in, careful not to cross the threshold. The compartment was empty, but the seat cushions were wrinkled, as if someone had been sitting for hours. A coat was folded neatly on the opposite seat. A scarf lay across the floor. I didn't go in. Returning to my compartment, I found the suitcase moved again. This time, it lay on its side. I waited, heart pounding, until the train jerked back to life. It began to move, slow at first, then faster. But something had changed. The scenery outside was unfamiliar. We were no longer on the same route. The signs I saw as we passed were not in Hungarian anymore, or in any language I recognized. I tried to find help, walked the full length of the carriage and into the next. Suddenly, the connecting door opened without resistance. The next carriage was identical to mine. Same upholstery, same lights, same empty compartments, except one. In the far end, a door stood open. The inside was a mirror of my own. Same seats, same curtain, same bag. But no one was there. I backed away. The doors closed behind me with a hiss. When I returned to my compartment, something sat on the opposite seat. A small object, metallic old-fashioned. A pocket watch. Its cover was engraved with initials I didn't recognize. I hadn't brought it. I didn't touch it. At the next station, if it could be called that, we stopped again. A structure of stone and iron, covered in moss and grime, loomed outside. No name on the platform. No people. Only a bench and an old lamp flickering against the morning fog. I stepped off. The cold hit me like a wave. I turned, intending to speak to the conductor, to ask where we were, but the train was already pulling away. I hadn't seen anyone disembark with me. Alone on the platform, I waited for the sun, but it never rose. The sky stayed gray, heavy, stretched too thin. There was no road, no signs of town or travel, just woods, thick and silent. Eventually, I followed a path into the trees. I don't remember how long I walked, hours, perhaps days. The watch, the one I hadn't taken, was now in my coat pocket. I don't know how it got there. When I finally reached a village, it was old. Too old. The houses looked abandoned, but weren't. Lights glowed inside. A church bell rang, even though there was no church. I asked no questions. I stayed in an inn whose keeper I never saw. Food appeared at my door. The nights were long. The train station here was always closed. But sometimes at night, I hear the distant whistle of a train echo through the trees. It never stops. It only passes. And I wonder, as I hold the pocket watch and feel its silent tick against my palm, if I ever really left that train at all, or if the night still rolls on somewhere, forever, behind the window pane. Story 2. I arrived in Sao Paulo on a humid March afternoon in 2025, not for leisure, but under the weight of something darker, an assignment that had already begun to unravel my nerves before I'd even stepped off a plane. As an independent investigator specializing in financial fraud and regulatory breaches, I had seen my share of strange cases, but nothing quite like this. I had been contacted anonymously through encrypted channels. A string of burial insurance claims had drawn suspicion, not due to individual size or amount, but for the sheer number of deaths reported in such a narrow time frame across various municipalities, tied to a single insurance broker group operating in southeastern Brazil. The email had been sparse. Just data. A spreadsheet of names, dates, policy numbers, and payout transactions, all paid to the same limited network of beneficiaries. The sender had left no name, no traceable footprint, only the suggestion. It's not disease. It's not disaster. It's design. The first cemetery I visited was in Campinas. Rows of modest headstones spread across sun-bleached grass, the soil still soft around several newer graves. The caretaker, a quiet man in his 60s, confirmed there had been an uptick in burials, but nothing out of the ordinary in terms of cause. No epidemic, no catastrophe, just more deaths. I wasn't here to question the reality of loss. I was here to question the story behind it. I visited registry offices next. A pattern emerged. Most of the deceased had no known family beyond the listed next of kin, a vague designation that, curiously, often connected back to a single name, Josue. Sometimes Josue Pereira, sometimes J. Santos. Never in person, always on paper. His name was linked to at least 42 death benefits in just 2 months. The insurance firm that processed most of these policies was a small operation in Sorocaba. Their building stood on the corner of a quiet street, sandwiched between a bakery and a closed hardware store. Inside, their lobby had the sterile feel of bureaucracy, plastic chairs, stale coffee, and dusty brochures. Most of the staff had no knowledge of the issue. The policies had been processed through an external broker working remotely. The manager offered me access to archive files, citing an internal review underway. I sat in a windowless room for hours, poring over applications and disbursement forms. Signatures mismatched, dates overlapped. Medical histories were often missing or suspiciously identical. And in every case, the listed cause of death was natural: stroke, cardiac arrest, complications from diabetes. But there were no accompanying hospital records. No funeral home receipts. Only certificates issued from small-town registries with little oversight. I took a bus to one of those towns, Itapeva, tucked into the hills, where the air felt older than the pavement and dogs slept lazily under bougainvillea vines. There, I visited the local registry office and requested to see a handful of the certificates in question. They were real, issued by the state, proper seals, ink, and signatures. But as I examined the logbook, a chill moved through me. The handwriting was the same for nearly every entry across a 2-week stretch. Same slope, same pressure, same pen, even though they were signed by different individuals, doctors, clerks, undertakers. The writing was unmistakably identical. I photographed the pages, thanked the clerk, and walked back through town with a knot tightening in my chest. Back in Sao Paulo, I cross-referenced the names of the deceased with national ID databases and property records. Most of them had no assets, no debt, no family. Many were listed as unemployed or retired, with no social security activity. Some had been reported as missing years before. Some didn't exist at all. Ghost identities fabricated from frayed threads of real people. This wasn't simply insurance fraud. This was something deeper. I began to track the supposed burial sites. They were scattered across 4 states, often in poor or remote areas. I flew to Belo Horizonte and rented a car. The next stop was a village cemetery outside Sete Lagoas. A list of names, 6 individuals supposedly buried within the same week, had drawn my attention. The cemetery's records matched the death certificates. But when I examined the physical plots, 5 had no markings, just loose soil, no headstones, no signs of maintenance. The 6th had a cross with the wrong name. I stood there, surrounded by quiet wind and the far-off buzz of insects, wondering who, if anyone, had ever truly been laid to rest in those plots. A pattern emerged in the burial contracts, low-cost packages arranged through a specific funeral service provider, Casa Eterna. The company existed, technically, though no fixed address was listed. Its phone line rang to voicemail. The website was bare bones, with generic stock images and no names attached. I dug deeper into their licensing. The listed business number had been registered under a different name only 6 months prior, an agricultural import firm. The change had been approved without audit. I submitted a request to local authorities to inspect the supposed funeral office, located in a warehouse district outside Ribeirão Preto. When I arrived, the building was locked, windows shuttered, no signage. I walked the perimeter. On the back wall, a faded spray paint outline suggested an old company name, something to do with scrap metal. I wasn't alone. A black car sat at the far end of the lot. Windows tinted. Engine off. I waited, pretending to scroll through my phone. It didn't move. After a few minutes, I turned and walked away, my instincts screaming to abandon the site. Back in my hotel room that night, I reviewed the documents again, pages of policies, fabricated names, ghost deaths, and recycled burial sites. At the center of it all, the same P.O. box address showed up on more than a dozen applications, one tied to the same broker ID. Josue. I passed everything to a trusted contact at a regulatory agency. They confirmed what I feared. This was a large-scale identity fraud ring, feeding false deaths into insurance firms using rural bureaucracy and under-monitored records to generate consistent payouts. The policies were always small enough to avoid audits. 8,000 Brazilian reals here, 12,000 Brazilian reals there. But multiplied by dozens, even hundreds, they added up. Within weeks, investigators began uncovering similar activity in other regions. Multiple arrests were made in connection with forged documents and falsified death certificates. Several small-town registrars were placed under administrative review. The insurance firm in Sorocaba quietly suspended operations. Casa Eterna's website vanished, but the man called Josue was never found. The identities he used, the addresses he gave, the phone numbers and bank accounts, all vanished in a carefully timed retreat. It was as if he'd always been a shadow. Weeks later, I received a final message from the anonymous sender. No name, no sign-off, just a sentence that stayed with me. Some people make money off the living, others do better with the dead. The words lingered in my mind like a fog that refused to lift. I returned home, but I carried the weight of the story with me. The silence of the unmarked graves, the names no one remembered, the contracts that cashed in on absence. Fraud is rarely just about money. It's about erasure, about knowing no one will come looking, that no one will ask too many questions when the dead are already forgotten. In the end, the case faded from headlines, buried beneath louder stories. But I still see their names sometimes on old lists in dusty archives. The ones who never existed. The ones who, somehow, were paid for in full. Story 3. I arrived in Nagasaki in early March 2025, drawn not by duty, but by curiosity. The Lantern Festival had always fascinated me, not just for its beauty, but for its history. It began as a Chinese New Year celebration, growing over the years into a citywide spectacle of glowing reds, floating dragons, and reflections shimmering across the calm waters of the port. That year, the event carried even more weight. It marked the full reopening of Japan's coastal festivals, following a long hiatus during the pandemic years. As an independent journalist covering international culture and public safety, I had come to report on how the festival had returned to its roots, honoring both tradition and resilience. I didn't expect my trip to become anything more than a quiet profile. I didn't expect to find myself in the center of something far stranger. My hotel overlooked Minato Park, where most of the lantern displays were clustered. Each evening, I ventured into the crowds, notebook and camera in hand, capturing the ambience. The warm glow of paper lanterns suspended like stars, the hush of footsteps along cobbled walkways, the soft murmurs of families, tourists, and performers. It was peaceful, still, but something shifted on the third night. It began with a pause, a moment when the crowd stilled, not panicked, not frightened, just uncertain. People looked up at the sky, not at fireworks or lanterns, but at the rooftops. Something or someone had disturbed the mood. Later, I would remember that moment vividly. The silence, the strange crackle on nearby security radios, the flickering of one lantern as it swayed against a sudden gust. At first, there was no sound, no alarm, no scream, just the vague sense that something wasn't quite right. But then a ripple moved through the crowd, slow at first, then faster, as people began stepping back from the central square. I looked toward the elevated roof of the old Customs House building, a structure left intact from pre-war days, now used as a lighting operations hub for the festival. Something glinted up there. The police arrived quietly. No sirens, no weapons drawn. They moved through the crowd with quiet precision, urging people to shift away from the plaza without drawing attention. Their restraint was almost eerie, as if they too weren't sure what was happening yet. I stepped back and watched the lanterns sway gently, casting orange and red shadows across the square, the warmth of the lights contrasting with the cold dread settling over the air. That night, I reviewed my photos, frame by frame. I found something odd in two of them, a slight shift in light reflecting from the roof. It looked like the barrel of something metallic, nothing conclusive, just an object that didn't belong amid the ornate wooden railings and paper lantern rigs. The local news ran no major headlines the next day, only a small advisory in the morning update. Increased police presence at night due to security protocols. No mention of danger, no mention of rooftops. But I had seen something, felt something. I returned to the square the next evening, keeping my distance from the main crowd. I noticed surveillance drones higher than usual, small, silent things that blinked red when they banked against the clouds. Uniformed officers now flanked the alleys, though they blended well with the festival staff, their bright vests blending into the landscape of light. Again, the festival continued. Families posed for pictures beneath dragon arches. Children carried small fish-shaped lanterns. But the sense of something veiled persisted, a tension in the air, as if the city was holding its breath. On the fifth night, the atmosphere cracked. A single sound, sharp, distant, but unmistakable, cut through the air. Not loud, not close, but it was there. Something had been discharged. At first, no one reacted, as if refusing to believe it. Then came the quiet rush of movement. Officers gesturing toward exits, performers stepping down from stages, lanterns dimming one by one in coordinated shutdown. There was no chaos, just a collective exhale. I moved instinctively toward the far end of the plaza, where a cordon had formed near the footbridge by the river. I wasn't the only one. A few other journalists had begun arriving by then, though they stood further back, unsure of what was happening. I stayed quiet, pressing against the edge of a tree for cover, scanning the rooftops again. A figure moved, swiftly, silently, between two towers across the plaza. I could barely make out the silhouette, but it wasn't police. The body language was different, measured, detached. The authorities later confirmed that the man had been armed. A sniper, though not in the way people imagine for movies. There was no political statement, no ideology. He hadn't fired on the crowd. He hadn't injured anyone. He had instead aimed at very specific targets, light sensors. Over 5 nights, he had shot out 12 of them. The light sensors controlled the synchronization of the lanterns when they flickered on, how they responded to surrounding brightness, how they adjusted for weather. His interference had caused subtle irregularities in the patterns. Some lanterns dimmed early. Others refused to turn on at all. The final shot had been the only one close enough to trigger public reaction. He was found hours later, in an abandoned hotel slated for demolition near the harbor. No resistance, no explanation, no manifesto. Just a rifle, a change of clothes, and maps marked with coordinates of light control hubs. He had no prior military experience, no record of violence, no known affiliation. He simply wanted to interrupt the festival. Authorities speculated he may have suffered from isolation. A former electrical engineer who had lost his job years earlier. A man who had once worked on similar lighting systems for urban installations before his company went under. When I saw his photo days later, I felt something strange. He didn't look angry. He looked tired. The festival resumed, albeit under increased surveillance. I stayed until the final night, walking the edge of the crowd, watching as the last of the lanterns drifted upward into the sky on strings and wires and dreams. The city seemed determined to reclaim its beauty, its normalcy. But something had changed for me. I kept thinking about how invisible he had been, how easy it had been for one man to disrupt something so carefully crafted, not with violence, but with precision, with silence. I wrote my piece not about fear, but about fragility, how even the brightest spaces have shadows, how public joy often rests on unseen tension, quiet vigilance. I included nothing graphic, Just details, shapes, timing, light. In the end, the man faced charges related to public safety violations, not terrorism. Psychiatrists deemed him unfit for trial. He was transferred to a facility in Kyushu, away from the noise. But still, sometimes I think about how he chose his targets. Not people, not buildings, just sensors, just signals, as if he wanted the lights to fade for a reason only he could understand. Back home, whenever I see lanterns in parks or temples, I remember the hush in Nagasaki, the way a whole city flickered for a moment, and the silence that followed. Story 4. The cold air in the high Tatras always has a distinct taste to it, thin, sharp, almost metallic at times. When I arrived in early March 2025, snow still lingered in the valleys, but spring was tugging at the edges of winter. Trees stood motionless in thick frost, but patches of thawed earth had begun to emerge between the pines. I came not as a tourist, but as a volunteer. I had heard about the missing child on the radio in Bratislava, and something compelled me to go. I wasn't a rescue worker, not officially. My background was in environmental journalism, and I had spent years covering isolated mountain communities and climate patterns in Central Europe. I knew these forests well, at least on paper, but something about the tone of the broadcast struck me. A 5-year-old had disappeared during a family outing on the Slovak side of the Tatra Mountains. No signs of struggle, no trail, just a momentary absence, and then nothing. The child's name wasn't released at first. Authorities described him simply as a local boy from the village's Dyer, one of those places tucked between white ridges and evergreen pockets, a town where time moved differently. I took the next train out. When I arrived, the search had already been underway for 2 days. Dozens of professionals were sweeping the forest, mountain rescue teams, volunteers, forestry workers. Some had dogs trained for alpine recovery. Others worked with drones and thermal imaging. I reported to the volunteer tent near the trailhead and was assigned to an outer perimeter search line, mainly helping to scan tree hollows, rock crevices, and snowbanks at the mid-elevation zone. My group moved quietly through the forest each morning, our boots crunching frost and branches. It was too early in the year for the full flood of tourists, and the silence was almost oppressive. I kept listening for birds, for any shift in the wind that might carry a voice, a cry, or even a sound that didn't belong. But the mountain held its silence. Each evening, we returned to the base, leaving behind flag markers and notes for the next shift. Nobody spoke much. The mood was respectful, patient, cautious. Some clung to hope. Others seemed haunted. It's strange how quickly even the most seasoned searchers begin to act differently, more reverent, when a missing person isn't found in the first 48 hours. By the third night, rumors began to swirl. Not in any malicious way, just fragments of worry, shaped by fear and fatigue. Some volunteers claimed their dogs had picked up faint scents that vanished within meters. Others mentioned strange patterns in the snow, tiny boot prints that led nowhere, or vanished near boulders without logical explanation. I didn't pay those stories much attention at first. Mountains can play tricks on the senses. Snow can cover tracks in seconds. Animals wander in unpredictable ways. But something about the atmosphere unsettled me. The quiet here wasn't peaceful. It felt like something was holding its breath. On the 4th day, my group was reassigned to a ravine just below the tree line, a section known for sudden drop-offs and deep, narrow passes where snow melted unevenly. It was a difficult hike. Ice clung stubbornly to the rocks. The air thinned quickly. I remember slipping once and bruising my shoulder against a pine trunk, the bark dusting my coat with flakes of frozen resin. Midway through our sweep, I spotted something unusual near the base of a snow-covered stone ledge. Not movement, just color. A bright thread of orange caught in a juniper bush. I approached carefully. It was a piece of fabric, the corner of what looked like a child's jacket. We marked the location and alerted the main team immediately. The area was cordoned off, and trained units with thermal gear began canvassing the surrounding slope. Hours passed, but no other signs surfaced. The fabric was confirmed to match the description of a child's jacket, but it offered no direction, no trail, no clear suggestion of where he had gone next. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the placement of that cloth, how it had looked freshly snagged, as if it hadn't been there for days. But nobody could explain how it appeared in a zone we had searched just the day before. And then there was the question of exposure. A 5-year-old couldn't survive long in sub-zero conditions, not without food, not without shelter. The search widened again the next morning, this time stretching toward the caves near the lower ridges. These were often overlooked in early spring, partially hidden under snow and branches, but I knew them from past reporting trips. Most were shallow, but a few tunneled deep into the hills. I volunteered to explore one near the edge of the western bluff, a known wildlife shelter. Crawling inside, I used my flashlight sparingly, sweeping the ground for prints, clothing, or items that didn't belong. Nothing, just damp stone and frozen soil. When I emerged, something made me stop and turn. Just above the cave mouth, a low tree bent under the weight of snow, and from its branches dangled another thread of orange fabric. It looked deliberate, as if someone had tied it there. It was enough to prompt another alert. This time, searchers found something more. A set of faint prints leading away from the ridge, barely visible under a dusting of new snow. They were small, erratic, possibly left by someone stumbling or being carried. We followed the trail until it disappeared at a frozen creek, where melting ice had smudged the path into slush. Drones were deployed again, and one spotted what looked like a small figure lying at the edge of the forest, curled beneath an overhang of rock and moss. He was there, alive, disoriented, weak, but breathing. Medics airlifted him immediately. It was only later we learned he had spent much of the time sheltered in a natural hollow, insulated by moss and a layer of pine needles. He had no memory of how he got there. He recalled walking away from the trail after hearing something. He didn't say what, and then nothing until the sound of rushing water and a dim, cave-like space. Some suspected he'd wandered far and taken shelter instinctively. Others whispered about the mountain itself, a place of legends and old folk tales, where the forests are said to hide things that protect as much as they mislead. In my final report, I didn't lean into those myths. I wrote of nature's indifference, of survival and luck, and of how even the most vast wilderness sometimes bends just enough to offer mercy. The boy recovered fully. His family never spoke to the media, and I respected their choice. But even now, when I think of the Tatra Mountains, I think of those quiet moments in the snow, the strange stillness of the forest, and the sudden, impossible threads of orange that led us where maps could not. There are places in the world where reason doesn't fully apply, places where the line between coincidence and miracle feels thinner than air. And I will always believe that this was one of them. Story 5. The air was dry when I arrived in Nairobi. The skies hazy with the red dust that drifted in from the surrounding plains. It was March 2025, the end of the dry season, and I had come not for the landscapes or the wildlife, but for something buried beneath the surface, a silence that had settled over a story no one seemed willing to tell. I had worked as an investigative journalist for over a decade. Most of my assignments had taken me to quieter corners of Europe, financial cover-ups, corporate scandals, whispers of corruption that rarely made international headlines. But in late February, I received a message that was different. It came from a colleague I hadn't spoken to in years. Her name was Miriam, Kenyan-born, fearless, meticulous. She had once been the kind of reporter others quietly admired, but never matched in boldness. Her message was brief, oddly formal, with a trace of urgency I hadn't seen from her before. She didn't include specifics, only that she had been tracking a story involving foreign development funds, shell companies, and mysterious disappearances in rural counties. She wanted to meet in person. She didn't trust email. She said she was close to something. When I landed, I learned she was gone. Not missing, dead. Her body had been found 2 days earlier, outside a small compound near the edge of Eldoret, hundreds of kilometers from Nairobi. The official report stated it was an accident. No further details were released. Local media mentioned her name only once. There were no editorials, no tributes, no questions. I stayed quiet at first, observing. Her flat in Nairobi had been sealed, her phone disconnected. I visited the building anyway and spoke with the guard outside. He remembered her, said she had seemed tense for weeks, often returning late, rarely speaking. That was all he knew, or was willing to say. I checked into a modest guest house nearby and began going through old notes and emails we'd exchanged over the years. Miriam had always encrypted her most sensitive work, and I remembered her habit of writing decoy articles filled with innocuous details that served as keys to unlock the real content. It was a method born out of necessity. One article stood out. It was dated January 2025 and framed as a human interest piece about rural water access in Turkana County. On the surface, it was dry and bureaucratic, but I noticed the names of contractors were repeated in a pattern. When I cross-referenced them with government records, several were tied to foreign firms. On paper, aid and infrastructure development agencies. But their Kenyan operations didn't exist physically. No offices, no staff, no listed partners. It was a shell, and the money was vanishing. I traced the trail further, moving carefully, reaching out to trusted contacts in the region. One of them, a retired accountant who had worked briefly on a regional aid board, confirmed my suspicions. He had seen large amounts of funding redirected through proxy firms to ghost projects, road repairs, sanitation programs, housing units that were never built. The paper trail looked clean, but satellite images and on-the-ground checks showed empty lots or half-dug trenches. Miriam had been following this money, and someone had known. I traveled to Eldoret, where she had been found. The local authorities were reluctant to speak. Her name prompted brief expressions of sympathy, followed by deflections. I visited the site myself, a dry patch of scrubland not far from a private property guarded by men in plain clothes. Cameras dotted the perimeter. I didn't approach. Instead, I circled outward, walking the road she might have taken, noting distances and locations she might have observed. I found a farmer who remembered seeing a woman there in early March. He said she was taking photos, writing in a notebook, sometimes waiting for hours near a large drainage ditch that connected to an abandoned warehouse. I returned that evening. The warehouse was half collapsed, its roof sagging with rust. Weeds crept through the concrete, but inside, it smelled faintly of oil and paper. In one corner, under a loose plank, I found the remnants of a burned file folder. Some pages had survived, edges charred but legible. One bore the logo of an international agency I recognized, an organization that publicly promoted health access but had recently been scrutinized for its opaque funding channels. Another page listed coordinates. I followed them the next morning using an old GPS unit Miriam had once mailed me for emergencies. The path led through scattered fields across a shallow stream to a low, fenced compound partially hidden by trees. No signs, no markings, no vehicles, but faint tire tracks suggested activity. I didn't enter. I didn't need to. I had enough. By the time I returned to Nairobi, I was being followed. It wasn't overt, just patterns. A man on the corner each evening. A dark SUV parked 2 blocks down from my guest house, always with tinted windows. My room was entered once, though nothing was taken. I left it messy on purpose. The alignment of the curtain was wrong when I came back. I booked a return flight for the following day, but spent the night compiling my notes, encrypting files, uploading them to cloud servers, and drafting my piece. It wasn't just about Miriam anymore. It was about a network of misused aid, faceless companies, and deliberate silences. But at the center of it was her. She had died for this, and no one had said her name since. When I boarded my flight home, I carried with me a copy of her final draft, the one she had been working on in secret. Her style was all over it, clean, steady, fearless. She had uncovered enough to demand international attention. It ran a week later. My publisher released it under both our names. The headline bore her voice more than mine. Global watchdogs began their own inquiries. Several of the shell firms shut down overnight. Official denials came swiftly, followed by resignations in 2 donor agencies and the quiet dissolution of a private contracting firm in Nairobi. There was no formal investigation into her death, but her story lived. In the months that followed, I kept in touch with her family, now relocated, seeking calm and distance. They never asked why she had kept digging. They had always known she couldn't stop. Sometimes, when the wind shifts at night and I hear the distant hum of traffic outside my apartment in Berlin, I remember the hush of those planes, the quiet way truth disappears when nobody is watching, and how Miriam refused to look away. In the end, I think that's what journalism really is, not the search for headlines, but the refusal to let silence win. And in that silence, she still speaks. Story 6. It was a cold, still morning in March 2025 when I first arrived in the small village of Bad Lauterberg, nestled within the Harz Mountains in northern Germany. I had been here before, years ago, on a short assignment covering rural revitalization efforts, but this time I was chasing something else, something quieter, something more unsettling. The assignment came to me almost by accident. A brief, anonymized tip had landed in my inbox just 2 weeks earlier. It claimed that an alternative wellness clinic operating in Lower Saxony had been connected to a string of unexplained deaths. The tip included a single name, Vital Sanctum. At first, I hesitated. Alternative health centers had long thrived on ambiguity, offering hope to the desperate, drawing patients with chronic illnesses and terminal diagnoses. Most did no harm, at least not directly, but this one sounded different. I spent days combing through regional news archives, looking for mentions of Vital Sanctum. Very little appeared. A few brief online reviews, mostly generic and vague. An obituary here and there, never linked explicitly to the clinic, yet always describing a peaceful passing following a private healing journey in the countryside. The language felt curated, as if scripted. Then I found a blog post from a woman named Elsk, dated back to January. Her sister, diagnosed with advanced lymphoma, had traveled from Bremen to undergo a 3-week naturopathic treatment at the facility. She never returned. The clinic reported a sudden cardiac event. No autopsy was requested. Elsk's questions went unanswered. That was enough to send me packing. When I arrived, the town looked exactly as I remembered, quiet, picturesque. Its streets lined with timber-framed houses and early spring blossoms just beginning to push through the thaw. The clinic itself was situated beyond the village proper, at the edge of a forest, surrounded by modest fencing and carefully maintained hedgerows. A wooden sign marked the entrance. Its lettering was understated, tasteful. No advertisements, no flashing claims. I didn't check in as a journalist. I posed as a freelance writer recovering from burnout. The staff welcomed me without question. My room was spare but elegant, clean linen sheets, natural wood furnishings, and a balcony that overlooked a meadow. There was no Wi-Fi. Phones were discouraged. Days followed a rhythm. Sunrise meditations, herbal tonics, raw food meals, and guided energy realignment sessions. Most patients I encountered appeared older, many in frail health, all softly spoken. They called us guests rather than patients. The therapies were wide-ranging. Aromatherapy chambers, magnetic field beds, personalized detox plans. Nothing seemed overtly harmful at first glance. But something felt off. The staff avoided eye contact when asked direct questions. Medical histories were gathered but never documented in front of us. And each evening, without explanation, one guest would quietly disappear from the dining hall and not return the next morning. When I asked about the absences, I was told they had chosen to leave early or transferred to a sister facility. On the 4th day, I met an elderly man named Klaus during a group walk along the forest trail. He walked slowly, his breath strained. He spoke little, but his eyes told me more than his words. I sensed unease. That night, his room was empty. No announcement. No goodbye. I started keeping notes. Patient names, arrival dates, observed symptoms, behavior patterns, and disappearances. I mapped it all in a tiny notebook I kept hidden beneath the drawer lining. I knew I couldn't stay long. On the 6th day, a woman who had shared the room across from mine, a gentle lady from Belgium battling Parkinson's, was gone by morning. No one mentioned her. What raised my concern even more was what I witnessed one night by accident. I couldn't sleep. The air was heavy, my head clouded, as if something in the herbal infusions we were drinking dulled the senses. I stepped out onto the balcony just past midnight and saw two staff members, dressed in white, carrying something long and narrow into the forest path behind the facility. A stretcher or a wrapped body. I couldn't tell. I followed the trail the next morning. It curved behind a mossy hill and dipped into a shaded grove. There, buried beneath a veil of leaves, I found freshly turned earth. No marker, no sign of wildlife disturbance. Just a quiet patch of forest, trying too hard to look untouched. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't pack. I walked straight out the front gate, past the hedgerow, down the main road into town. I didn't stop walking until I reached the train station and boarded the first connection out, my mind racing. I said nothing to anyone, not until I reached Berlin. Back home, I filed a report with local health authorities. Then I wrote my article, carefully, cautiously, knowing the backlash would be swift. I included anonymized interviews with former employees I contacted later, who confirmed the use of undocumented experimental regimens on terminal patients. Most were encouraged to sign waivers upon arrival, waiving autopsy requests. Some were administered untested compounds derived from rare herbs and fungi, all of it under the guise of peaceful, holistic transition. The piece published a week later under the title The Silent Path, What's Really Happening at Germany's Vital Sanctum Clinic. The story spread faster than I expected. Within days, regional authorities launched an inquiry. The clinic suspended operations. Families of former guests began requesting exhumations. Not all were granted. Legal ambiguity cloaked the facility. It had operated under alternative health licensing, separate from formal medical regulation. But the public pressure mounted. By the end of March, several staff had resigned. 2 administrators were placed under investigation for negligence. It wasn't enough for many, but it was a beginning, a slow unraveling. To this day, the clinic's website remains offline. Its grounds are closed. Yet the memory lingers, the soft voices in the corridors, the scent of lavender masking a deeper unease, the quiet disappearances no one dared speak of. I still hear from families now and then. They ask what I saw, if I knew their loved ones, if I believed they were at peace. I tell them the truth. I don't know what peace looks like when it's scripted, but I know what silence feels like when it's forced. And in that forest, wrapped in healing language and rituals, something was deeply, irreversibly wrong. Story 7. It began like any other international trip I had taken. Routine, familiar, even comforting in its predictability. My assignment was a short one, just a 3-day layover in Doha to document the new sustainability features being implemented at Hamad International Airport. It was part of a larger story I'd been working on regarding eco-conscious aviation trends. I'd been through that airport twice before, and I remember admiring its design, sleek, quiet, efficient. This time, however, nothing went as planned. I landed in Doha early on a Monday morning in March 2025. The air outside was crisp for the region, a soft morning breeze rising off the Gulf. I felt alert, despite the overnight flight. Immigration moved swiftly. I presented my passport, gave a polite nod to the officer, and rolled my carry-on through the arrivals terminal. I noticed it first at the hotel. At check-in, the receptionist tapped something into her screen and paused. She asked to see my passport again. I handed it over, confused but patient. She studied it with more scrutiny than I was used to, then excused herself. When she returned, she apologized for the delay, then handed me the room key. At the time, I chalked it up to routine protocol. Perhaps they were updating records. It wasn't until the next morning that things began to unravel. I tried to check into the press area at the airport terminal for my guided tour. I gave my name, held up my accreditation badge, and waited. The attendant's face changed. She stepped back, checked a screen, and asked if I had already arrived the day before. I replied that I had, but she shook her head. According to the registry, Someone using my full name and passport number had already completed the airport briefing the previous evening. I thought it had to be a clerical error, maybe a duplicate entry. But then she pulled up a photo. It wasn't me. It was a man who bore a passing resemblance, similar hair, similar build, but older, thinner, with a sharper jawline. He had entered with a perfect match to my credentials, walked through the same terminal, and spoken to the same staff. He had signed my name. I didn't understand. Not fully. I stood there, baffled, as they contacted airport security. Within an hour, I was seated in a quiet administrative room inside the airport's operation center. A pair of officials, one from airport security, another from the Ministry of Interior, asked to see my documents. I provided everything: passport, work ID, itinerary, hotel receipt. They were polite, methodical. I didn't feel threatened, but I did feel very, very exposed. The questions were precise. Had I recently lost my passport? Had I applied for any duplicates? Had I used airport VIP services the night before? Had I been to Qatar in February? The answer to all of it was no. Eventually, they allowed me to return to the hotel, but I was asked not to leave the city without checking in again. My credentials were flagged, temporarily invalidated while they investigated. I returned to my room, shut the curtains, and tried to think through what had just happened. My passport had never left my side. I hadn't reported it stolen, and there had been no signs of tampering. My email accounts, bank cards, and phone were all functioning normally. It wasn't the typical case of digital identity theft. This was physical. Someone had presented themselves as me, down to the passport and facial likeness. I contacted my consulate. They had no record of any suspicious activity tied to my passport prior to this date. They made a note, issued a temporary advisory, and promised to follow up with Qatari authorities. I barely slept that night. The next morning, a quiet call from the hotel concierge asked me to come to the lobby. A man in a navy suit greeted me. He introduced himself as an investigator working with the airport fraud division. He had new information. We sat in the hotel cafe, and he opened a thin folder. Inside were stills from airport surveillance. The man impersonating me had passed through immigration using a biometric gate, iris and facial scan. He had breezed through, his passport data perfectly aligned with mine. That, the investigator said, was what made it so unusual. It wasn't just a forged document. It was a one-to-one replica. They believed the man had obtained a highly sophisticated clone of my passport embedded with accurate RFID chip data. My guess was that it had been pulled from some previous hotel scan, travel registry, or even a breach I wasn't aware of. The biometric match, though, meant that someone had either doctored the database or employed facial masking technology, something law enforcement had only seen in state-level espionage cases. I wasn't a spy. I was a journalist covering green infrastructure. But apparently, that didn't matter. The impersonator had used my identity to access a restricted area inside the cargo sector of the airport. After that, his trail vanished. No boarding pass was recorded. No onward flight. He seemed to have come and gone for a single task. I spent the rest of the day under light watch. No handcuffs, no official detainment, but my movements were monitored. They offered to relocate me to a secure guest facility, but I chose to remain in my hotel. The sun set over the Gulf in streaks of gold, and still I had no answers. By the third day, word arrived that I had been cleared. My credentials were reinstated. Whatever the man had done, there was no indication that I was involved or even knowingly compromised. I was allowed to leave, and my flight home was rescheduled. But before I departed, I was handed a sealed envelope from the investigator. Inside were a few printed documents, summaries of the incident, advisories on identity protection, and a single photograph of the impersonator walking away from the customs hall. He looked calm, professional, as if he'd done it before. Back in Europe, I started writing, not just about sustainable airports anymore, but about identity, surveillance, and how digital security had evolved beyond fingerprints and passwords. My story was published a week later. A name in the wrong hands. My encounter with the invisible passenger. I still don't know who he was or what he was after. But every time I travel now, every time I walk through a security gate or hand over my passport, I wonder not just if I am who I say I am, but if someone else might be using me to pass through the same doors unnoticed. And that's what unsettled me the most. Not the theft, but how silently it had been done. Story 8. I first heard about the so-called ice cult through a fragment of a news report in early March 2025, while I was on assignment in northern Norway. The region, famous for its breathtaking fjords and long, cold winters, was known for attracting a mix of adventurers and those seeking solitude in nature. But this story was different. It had a quiet, chilling gravity that compelled me to delve deeper. The ice cult, as the media dubbed it, was a small community of people living in the remote Lingen Alps. According to the initial reports, several members of this group had died under mysterious circumstances during a particularly harsh cold snap that month. The local police were cautious in releasing details, citing ongoing investigations. The news was sparse, but enough to intrigue me. I decided to travel there, hoping to uncover more about who they were and what had happened. I arrived in Tromsø, the nearest city to the Lingen region, in mid-March. The snow was still deep, the air sharp and clean, and the nights long and cold. I rented a sturdy vehicle equipped for snowy terrain and drove east toward the mountains, following winding roads flanked by frozen lakes and towering pines dusted with snow. Reaching the outskirts of the settlement took hours. The ice cult wasn't marked on any map I had, nor did any local guide speak openly about it. What I found was a cluster of wooden cabins nestled in a valley, their rooftops thick with snow. It looked like a small village frozen in time. I later learned it was a community of about 50 people who had formed what they described as a spiritual fellowship centered around nature, ice, and enduring the extremes of the Arctic environment. At first glance, their lifestyle seemed austere but peaceful. They embraced the harshness of their surroundings as a form of purification and resilience. Their practices involved prolonged exposure to the elements, fasting, meditation, and rituals meant to connect the body and soul with the purity of ice. It was a philosophy that celebrated endurance, simplicity, and a profound respect for nature's unforgiving power. I was allowed to stay for a few days, observing their routines. Mornings began before dawn, with participants walking barefoot on ice or immersing themselves briefly in icy waters. Meals were sparse and mostly plant-based, supplemented by fish caught from nearby fjords. They wore traditional woolens, and their faces carried a serene intensity, as if shaped by the very cold they sought to honor. Despite the calm surface, there was an undeniable tension. Several cabins stood abandoned or marked by memorials, small, handcrafted crosses and painted stones, dedicated to those who had passed. The loss of life was not spoken of openly, but it lingered in the atmosphere. I discovered that the deaths were linked to a recent weather event, a brutal cold wave that plunged temperatures far below the usual March average. The community's leaders had encouraged members to engage in an extended purification retreat, involving days without shelter and minimal clothing, to test their spiritual resolve. What made the tragedy complex was that this practice was voluntary and deeply rooted in their beliefs. The authorities were wary of intervening, recognizing the fine line between personal freedom and public safety. But when the number of missing members reached a critical point, search parties were dispatched, uncovering individuals who had succumbed to exposure or hypothermia. I accompanied one such search team on their last expedition. The terrain was treacherous, slick ice, hidden crevices, and biting winds that threatened frostbite. Despite the risks, these volunteers were determined to find every missing person. What struck me most was the profound dedication the survivors showed toward honoring their lost friends. The funerals were simple but heartfelt, held outdoors under the pale sun of the Arctic spring. The community gathered in silence, wrapped in blankets, their breath visible in the cold air. There were no grand ceremonies, only a collective recognition of the fragility of life and the strength found in facing nature's extremes. In the days following, I spoke with several survivors, careful not to intrude on their grief. They shared their belief that death was not an end, but a transformation, an ultimate return to the ice and earth they revered. Their worldview was shaped by acceptance, not fear. Back in Tromsø, I researched similar communities and historical accounts of icebound cults or sects in Scandinavia. This particular group seemed unique, a modern iteration drawing on old Nordic traditions, but with a contemporary spiritual twist. Writing about the ice cult was challenging. I wanted to honor their sincerity without romanticizing the tragedy. Their story raised difficult questions about faith, autonomy, and the limits of human endurance. I left Norway with a mixture of respect and sorrow. The land was breathtaking, but the cost of such devotion was painfully evident. I understood why some sought meaning in the cold, in the silence, in the raw edges of existence. But I also saw the price that could be paid when the line between ritual and danger blurs. In the months since, local authorities have worked to create safety guidelines for extreme outdoor practices. The community, though diminished, remains, adapting slowly to a harsher reality while holding onto their core beliefs. For me, the ice cult story is a reminder of how humans seek connection, sometimes in ways we can scarcely understand, and how the elements, eternal and indifferent, shape the paths we choose. Story 9. March in France has a particular chill in the air, crisp yet awakening, as if winter lingers, but spring is knocking quietly on the door. That month found me in a small town in the Loire Valley, drawn by a story not about vineyards or castles, but about tragedy in one of the region's oldest hotels, a place steeped in history, elegance, and now, an unsettling mystery. The Hotel de l'Époque was a grand structure dating back to the 18th century. Its walls had witnessed centuries of travelers, nobles, and artists. The polished oak floors echoed the footsteps of eras long past. Velvet curtains draped heavy windows overlooking a cobblestone square. Guests came expecting the charm of yesteryear, combined with modern comfort. I was there as an investigative journalist, invited by the local authorities to document the aftermath of an event that shook the town to its core, a double homicide that had occurred within the hotel's storied halls. The morning of March 14, 2025, was unremarkable in its calm, but by midday, whispers and murmurs had swept through the community. 2 guests, both long-term visitors, had been found deceased in their adjoining suites. The details were scarce. The police urged discretion. The hotel management pleaded for privacy. When I arrived, the hotel was already under a gentle siege of reporters and curious onlookers. Yet inside, the atmosphere was subdued, almost reverent. The staff moved with careful steps, balancing the demands of normal service with the weight of recent tragedy. I met with the hotel's manager, a woman whose graceful composure masked the stress of the situation. She allowed me access to the common areas and the scene of the incident, now sealed off but described in detail. What struck me most was how this historic place seemed to hold its breath, as if mourning the loss of its own lifeblood. The victims were not strangers to the town. Both were scholars specializing in European history, staying for months to research archives and local heritage. Their presence had been uncontroversial, welcomed even, as they brought attention and prestige to the hotel and region. But in the days following their deaths, it became apparent that their research had unearthed something sensitive, something that perhaps some wished to keep buried. I spent my days walking through the hotel's labyrinthine corridors, speaking to staff and townspeople, piecing together a picture of the scholars' last days. They had been meticulous, passionate, often seen carrying thick notebooks and old manuscripts. Their focus had been on a series of documents related to a forgotten noble family whose influence once shaped the region's politics. A particularly intriguing discovery was that they had requested extended access to the hotel's private archives, a collection of letters, diaries, and records not open to the public. It seemed their investigation had led them to something that disturbed long-standing local narratives. Yet, despite the gravity of their deaths, the investigation unfolded quietly. The local police were thorough, combing through evidence and interviewing anyone connected to the victims. Their approach was professional, respectful, seeking truth without sensationalism. During this time, I had a chance to observe how the community grappled with the event. The hotel guests, many returning seasonally for the charm and calm, expressed shock and sorrow. Conversations in cafes and markets were hushed, filled with concern, but also an undercurrent of curiosity. The town's mayor emphasized unity and calm in press briefings, underscoring that this was an isolated incident, not reflective of the peaceful nature of the area. My reporting focused on balance, capturing the human side of the tragedy without dwelling on morbid details. I documented the lives of the victims, their dedication to history, and their passion for preserving knowledge. The hotel itself became a character in my narrative, resilient, dignified, and quietly grieving. Its grand staircase, adorned with frescoes and gilded banisters, was witness to sorrow and strength. One afternoon, I visited the adjoining suites where the tragedy occurred. The doors were sealed, but standing outside, I felt the weight of history pressing in. It was a strange juxtaposition, ancient walls holding modern secrets, timeless beauty shadowed by loss. As the investigation progressed, it became clear that the deaths were linked not to random violence, but to a complex web of personal conflicts intertwined with the scholar's discoveries. The case unfolded with careful steps, no dramatic chases or arrests, but the slow unspooling of hidden tensions. In the end, justice was pursued with patience and respect for the truth. The local police released a statement acknowledging that the perpetrators had been identified and legal proceedings were underway. I departed the Loire Valley with a sense of solemn reflection. The Hotel de l'Époque remained, as it had for centuries, a guardian of stories, some joyful, some tragic. It reminded me that history is alive, intertwined with the present in ways that can surprise and unsettle. Writing the story, I thought about the thin line between curiosity and consequence, about how places hold memories, some cherished, some dangerous, and about the quiet bravery of those who seek truth, even when it leads to dark places. The double homicide at the historic hotel was not just a crime. It was a poignant chapter in an ongoing narrative of human complexity, passion, and the pursuit of knowledge. Story 10. March in Serbia carries a peculiar air, a mixture of thawing winter and burgeoning hope. The streets of Belgrade buzzed quietly with life as I arrived for what was meant to be a routine assignment covering social issues in the Balkans. Little did I know then that I would find myself at the heart of an investigation, exposing something dark and deeply troubling: the uncovering of a child smuggling ring operating within the region. I had come to Serbia with the intention of documenting the efforts of local NGOs working to protect vulnerable children, those displaced by poverty, family hardship, or conflict. The NGOs were brave and tireless, navigating a complex social landscape marred by economic challenges and lingering scars from past turmoil. Their work was essential, but often underfunded and overlooked by the broader world. It was through one of these organizations, a trusted partner in the fight against human trafficking, that I first heard whispers of a shadow network involved in exploiting children for illegal adoption and trafficking abroad. The scale was uncertain, the details fragmented, but the implications were dire. What followed was a series of meetings with social workers, law enforcement officials, and families affected by these crimes. I traveled from Belgrade to smaller towns and villages, witnessing firsthand the fragility and resilience of communities grappling with forces far beyond their control. The ring was sophisticated, operating with layers of secrecy and deception. False documents, corrupt intermediaries, and complicit officials created a tangled web that was difficult to penetrate. Children were sometimes taken from impoverished families with false promises of care or education, only to disappear into unknown fates. In early March, coordinated raids were carried out by Serbian police and international agencies. I was invited to observe the aftermath, not the raids themselves, but the human stories that emerged in their wake. Shelters filled with children, many confused and scared, but safe for the first time in weeks or months. One particular shelter stayed with me, a modest building on the outskirts of Novi Sad. The staff there worked with quiet determination, providing medical care, counseling, and hope. The children were varied in age, many too young to understand the full scope of their situation, but eager for normalcy. I documented their routines, simple moments of play, learning, and rest that marked a fragile return to childhood. Each smile, each small accomplishment, was a testament to the strength of the human spirit amid tragedy. Conversations with social workers revealed the complexities of reintegration. Many children had no clear family to return to, their identities obscured by forged papers or lost records. The process of reuniting children with relatives or finding safe foster homes was painstaking and ongoing. During my time in Serbia, I also explored the legal framework surrounding trafficking and child protection. The government had made strides in recent years, passing stricter laws and collaborating with international bodies, but enforcement remained a challenge. Corruption and bureaucracy sometimes hampered progress, and the ring's exposure was a painful reminder of the work still needed. The community response was multifaceted. While many rallied to support victims and strengthen protections, others were wary, fearing the stigma such revelations could bring to their towns. I witnessed public forums where officials, NGOs, and citizens debated how best to safeguard children without alienating families or perpetuating fear. Throughout this period, I reflected deeply on the intersection of poverty, desperation, and crime. The smuggling ring thrived in the shadows, cast by economic hardship and social vulnerability. Addressing the root causes was as crucial as dismantling the criminal networks. My reporting aimed to shed light not only on the horrors uncovered, but also on the resilience and hope emerging from Serbia's efforts to heal and protect its youngest citizens. I sought to tell the stories of those working tirelessly to restore safety and dignity, often at great personal risk. As March drew to a close, the investigation continued to unfold. More arrests were made and international cooperation intensified. The children rescued were gradually finding care, their futures uncertain, but protected by a growing network of advocates. Leaving Serbia, I carried with me a profound respect for the courage of survivors and the determination of those fighting to end such exploitation. The story was not just one of crime and tragedy, but also of community, healing, and the unwavering belief in a better tomorrow.